Hello, welcome to Chapter 33 of the American Pageant on the Great Depression and the New Deal from 1933 to 1939. Today's video we're covering FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to creating jobs for the jobless. So let's get right into it. America's in the thick of the Great Depression. During the election event in 1932, they had to choose between the incumbent, Herbert Hoover, who tried a lot of reform. It was just not a lot. It was a little, too late. Wasn't a really good public relations man. Didn't talk to the public. You also have the bonus army fiasco versus the Democrat, the governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This is a very famous picture here of African Americans waiting in line, probably for a handout or for some charity work or for some charity help, with the billboard in the background saying there's no way like the American way, with this white family driving their car and smiling, and even a little doggy out here is having fun. So, Roosevelt, FDR, the politician in a wheelchair. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who's a distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, same last name, obviously. He was a Democratic candidate from 1932. His early career, he was an up-and-coming, promising politician, very similar arc and track of his cousin Theodore. He actually married his cousin, distant cousin Eleanor Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, President Roosevelt at the time, walked her down the aisle, so it was the Roosevelt wedding, and they are from New York, so that's a little different. He was very politically, she was very politically active. She was out there. She was his legs, his eyes and ears, because he was immobilized, which we'll get to her in a moment. She was loved by liberals and hated by conservatives. The press did not like her. They thought that she didn't know her place as a woman, and oftentimes would try to publish pictures of her not looking, like mid-sentence when you're like, not looking very good. Franklin Roosevelt, his career rose fast in the teens. He was the Assistant Secretary of Navy during World War I. He actually traveled to Europe, saw some artillery fired, but not really in the front lines. But that was the same position that his distant cousin Theodore had held in the Spanish-American War. He was the vice presidential candidate in 1920. Unfortunately, they were defeated by Warren G. Harding. In 1929, he contracted polio, which was usually a children's disease, and it struck him down and paralyzed him from the waist down. He thought his career was over. He was wheelchair-bound the rest of his life. He struggled back, and with the support of his family and mainly his wife, even though they weren't a loving marriage and there was some infidelity going on, he did return to politics. The public didn't know about his legs. The press tried to largely keep it out of the public eye. He wore massive leg braces underneath his pants so he could stand and give a speech with the help of a podium. And if you look carefully, in pictures, if he's standing up, he's being held by an arm or held up by another man. He's sitting down in a chair. He's kind of got a blanket over his legs. In fact, there's a door on the Oval Office of the Oval Office desk to cover up his wheelchair. Later on, there's a very famous picture of John F. Kennedy working at that desk, and his little son, John Jr., is peeking out through that little hatch there. He was elected the governor of New York in 1928 and 1930. He was an excellent public speaker. He's charismatic. He's charming. He just people like him. And whereas, Hoover is a genius and has all the answers, he didn't know how to talk to the people. Roosevelt admitted he didn't have all the answers, but he would get people around him, surround himself with experts that did. But he did know how to directly speak to the people. The Democrats in their platform called for a balanced budget. They also called for social and economic reforms in 1932. This photograph here was actually an old family photograph that was published after his death in 1945. Many people did not know, many of the American public did not know or were aware that he was in a wheelchair. They were almost dumbfounded by this picture because it was so hidden from the public. On the left is a picture of Eleanor going out to the mines to kind of examine what's going on, and she could go out on fact-finding missions, whereas he could not go down into a mine or hike through the forest. This is a picture of them when they were a young couple here, Eleanor and Franklin, and then Franklin as a young man here. There's a picture of Eleanor Roosevelt there, kind of giving you an idea what she looked like. So FDR attacked the Republican Old Deal and supported what was a New Deal for the forgotten man. Hoover believed that the worst of the Depression was over. He kept saying that good times are right around the corner and stability is going to be coming. Prosperity is just a little bit away. Just wait. At that point, during the election, 11 million people were still unemployed, and not to mention that Hoover called out the Army on the bonus army. It didn't look good. Hoover reaffirmed his faith in the American free enterprise and individualism and capitalism, and because of it, Hoover loses in a massive landslide. Blacks actually shifted their party allegiance to the Democrats. For the first time since African Americans had the right to vote, they did not overwhelmingly in big numbers vote Republican. And this is a dramatic shift in 1932 for African Americans to vote Democrat. And to this day, all the way up to most likely 2020, African Americans still vote Democrat. The Democrats also win control of both houses of Congress. And while he was waiting to take over because he's elected in November and then can't be inaugurated until March 4th, the Depression worsened. There was a massive run on banks. People panicked that banks were going to lose their money. They were going to run out of cash for the deposits. And so they rushed to withdraw all their money, causing the banks to close. Hoover met with FDR twice, tried to give him advice, tried to tell him what to do. Roosevelt was polite and kind of said, I'm going to do my own thing. In his inauguration speech on March 4th, 1933, at the worst part of the Great Depression, with thousands of banks failing, 11 to 13 million Americans out of work, Franklin Roosevelt said that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. If Dr. Evil is around, it would be sharks with laser beams attached to their heads, but he wasn't around, so it's the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Here's the electoral map of 1932. That's a pretty lopsided victory there for an incumbent president to be voted out of office, only winning Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. Ouch. So the New Deal. First thing Roosevelt did was tackle that banking crisis. He ordered banks to close, he and Congress, for a holiday on March 6th through 10th, 1933. This is just days after he's inaugurated. You don't need to push bankers very often to give them a little bit of urgency to take a day off. They're always willing to do so. And then the first 100 days, he calls this special session of Congress, and it breathes this new optimism, this new hope for the United States that things were going to turn around. The Depression was going to be fixed. There were 15 proposals to Congress, 14 were passed. They were largely rubber-stamped. They trusted FDR and his group of advisors that encircled him, known as the Brain Trust. Most of these advisors were Columbia University professors in New York City. There was a couple bills they didn't even read. They just passed them. So, like I said, there's new optimism. Congress unanimously passed the banking bill without even reading it. We don't need to read it. It's pretty good. And so what they did is they tackled the Great Depression like it was a war. They spent money the government didn't have, which is something our government may be addicted to today since we're like $22 trillion, a gajillion dollars in debt. And so they spent money that they didn't have. They were trying to bring the economy out of the Depression, trying to infuse cash into the economy to get people back to work. And this is collectively known as the New Deal. The New Deal had 3 R's: relief, recovery, reform. Relief was to end the suffering of the people at that time. Recovery is to get the nation's economy back to normal. And reform was to prevent another one from ever happening again. Kind of a big deal. I'm going to repeat them. Relief, end the suffering of the people. Recovery, get the economy back to normal. Reform, prevent another depression from happening again. And so those are the 3 R's, not the 3 R's they used to teach in school, which don't start with R's except one: reading, writing, arithmetic. Only one of them. Maybe that's why education wasn't good back then. Here's a picture of a guy. Here's work is what I want, not charity. Who will help me get a job? 7 years in Detroit. Man, people were begging in the streets. They were walking around desperate, just psychologically downtrodden, hoping for anything to lift them out of it. The New Deal bred this new optimism that, hey, we've got someone on our side. There's somebody on our corner helping out. Here's the principal New Deal acts during the 100 days of Congress. You have the Bank Holiday, you have the Emergency Relief and Banking Act, the Beer Act, they brought back alcohol, the CCC, getting rid of the gold standard, FIRA, the AAA, the TVA. We'll go through a lot of these and we'll come back to them. And then finally, the Glass-Steagall Act. So, the Emergency Banking Relief Act, FDR, basically Congress infused funds to protect and prop up the banking industries, and then he gave his first of not as many as you think, but many dozens of fireside chats. Roosevelt spoke directly to the people via the radio on a Sunday evening, and he told the American public exactly what Congress and himself were doing to fix the banking situation, to soothe their fears and make them know that they had nothing to worry about. There were 35 million listeners who tuned into this first fireside chat. On Monday, the banks reopened with this Relief Act, and it worked. Deposits outnumbered withdrawals. The banking crisis was stemmed off. And so FDR and Congress did a great job to prevent the collapse of the banking industry. Congress then later passes the Federal Deposit Insurers Corporations, or FDIC, as a part of the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act, which is still around today. Most banks are members of FDIC, meaning that if the bank closes or if it's robbed or if there's something that happens, your money, your deposits are insured. This is an old picture here that says up to $100,000. I believe they're insured up to $250,000 now. And this is a picture of President Roosevelt giving his fireside chats. Back then, they only insured the deposits up to $5,000. He also took the nation off the gold standard by having the Treasury buy gold from citizens to enable the economy to grow by printing money, not solely based on gold. From this point, only transactions in paper money were accepted. No longer were there gold or silver certificates or things like that going on. The goal was to create modest inflation. By infusing cash into the economy, people would spend money, and by spending money, businesses would be accelerated. They would have more production, and then they would have to hire more people, and more people having more jobs would spend more money, and it kind of is the opposite of how the Depression happened. And so they increased the amount of dollars in circulation. This is a picture of FDR chatting with reporters. He loved to, once a week, he would meet with the reporters and he would tell them officially on the record, and then he'd have his little off-the-record chats, and he'd have maybe a martini, and he would tell them stuff that they weren't supposed to hear, but he kind of meant them to hear that just to kind of test their reaction. And he really built up this really good rapport and relationship with the press, and so they wrote warmly about him. This is the number of bank failures in the United States before and after the FDIC. You can see in the 20s, even in the height of the boom of the 20s, you still had 618 banks failed. 1930, you got 1,300, 1931, 1932, and then 4,000 in 1933 alone. There's still some problems in 1957 or 1934 with 57. Fast forward to the end of World War II, not a single bank failed because America was making a lot of money from the war. So to create jobs for the jobless, so that relief, trying to get Americans back to work. One of the most popular and most prominent New Deal programs was the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. Some people have remarked that the New Deal is often called alphabet soup. There's so many initials. This is kind of the 20th century thing. We're gonna shorten it. We're gonna use initials. It's kind of that military speak almost. The CCC hired 2.5 million young men to build roads, plant trees, fight forest fires, improve the outdoors. They hired young single men ages 18 to 25. They had to be single, and they had to send a majority, I think 75 to 80% of their check home, because young men with a lot of money probably aren't going to spend it wisely. And so this was a very popular program. They worked all throughout all 50 states or 48 states at that time and all the territories, building all these fabulous things in the outdoors. I'll show you some pictures in a little bit. To infuse cash to the states to help the people that are suffering, and that part of that relief goal, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FERA or FERA, they gave money to the states just to give to handouts, basically. A part of that, you have the Civil Works Administration, which gave temporary jobs for the winter emergency, shoveling snow, you name it, sweeping the sidewalks, just a little bit of work, kind of piecemeal work, just to get some handouts, to get a little bit of money to help people through the tough winter. To help struggling farmers who had been struggling since the end of World War I, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or the AAA, not the auto one. They wanted to raise farm prices and control production, and so this was one of the most controversial things that Roosevelt did. They paid farmers oftentimes not to farm. The government would subsidize, so they would pay the income of the farmer, and in return they would not produce their crops. And so the idea is the farmer's still making their money, but they're lowering the supply of agricultural goods out there. By doing so, that raises the prices back up where other farmers can make a livable wage. What was controversial about it is they destroyed crops. They killed cattle. They slaughtered pigs. When there's millions of families that don't have a breadwinner, that are struggling, you have 2 million people that are homeless, the government is purposely destroying food. Because even if that food is being given away to charity, it's still out there, the supply is still there, it's still keeping prices down. Because of some of the legislation in this, the AAA, in terms of the mandates of what you could use and what products, the Supreme Court actually eventually threw this out, ruled it unconstitutional, and Congress had to rework it and bring it back. So they did slaughter 6 million pigs at the height of the Great Depression when people were really struggling just to put food on the table. They paid farmers not to farm, which is a subsidy. Still happens quite a bit today, not on the large, wide scale that it did back then. Like I said, the Supreme Court shot it down in 1936. To help households not go into foreclosure, for people that had a hard time paying their mortgages, you have the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or the HOLC, or HOLC, to try to fixed that problem. It sounded like I said hope. So here's a picture of all the camps in 1938 that were in the CCC. You can see they were pretty prevalent. In western Colorado, there was a camp in Rifle, Colorado, where I grew up in 1934. There's a picture of Rifle Mountain Park, of the old camp there. The next year, they moved to Glenwood Springs, where Sayre Park is and where they have Strawberry Days. This is a picture of the CCC camp in Rifle, and there's actually a group of young African Americans who came to Rifle and worked, and they formed their own baseball team and played in the city baseball league, and half the town came out to watch them because they had not seen African American people, so they were kind of curious. And so this is a poster for the CCC. They employed artists to create these things as well. Here's some more of the late New Deal measures. We're going to kind of skip that. And that's all we have for today. If you have any questions, let me know. Contact me directly. Hope you enjoyed this.